Thank you very much. And welcome to the Frontline Club. Last Saturday was a historic occasion, sadly not for England, who were hammered by Ireland, but the fact that that match took place at Croke Park, which for many, many years has been the citadel of Irish republicanism, was in itself remarkable. The way in which the predominantly, obviously, Irish crowd conducted itself was also indicative. And many encouraging noises were made about, the new Ireland, the new way ahead, the new future. Whether or not that bodes well or ill for the reality of what we're about to face over the next few weeks, with elections to the new Northern Ireland Assembly, again, a week on Wednesday, and then the deadline for an agreement on power sharing by the 26th of March, we'll have to wait and see. We're going to discuss the future of Northern Ireland, the big picture, if you like. But first of all, we're going to discuss the centrality of the issue of policing to Northern Ireland and the role it will play in reaching any settlement. And the panel tonight will be John O'Dowd, who is Sinn Féin's chief whip in the Northern Ireland Assembly. My colleague John Ware, who's been covering Ireland as long as I have and comes decked with awards. John did the famous seminal investigation into Omar and the equally seminal investigation into Collusion. Henry McDonald, who for many years has been the Observer's Irish editor, and Henry has written half a dozen books, 3 of which are based on the various aspects of Northern Irish paramilitarism, some of which are on my bookshelves. And lastly, out there in the ether somewhere, is Ian Paisley Jr. And with any luck, he will come winging his way in over the airwaves and take part in this discussion, because obviously it's very, very important that we have a contribution from the DUP, as the DUP will be absolutely central to any agreement which may or may not emerge by the end of next month. Just before we start, just a quick sit rep, and to help us understand why policing is so important in deciding whether or not there is going to be the kind of power-sharing executive which is the hope of the British and Irish governments. That Tony Blair and Bertie Ahern said that devolution will be restored, in other words, direct rule ended, if there is proper support from Sinn Fein for the rule of law and the police, and there's a commitment on the part of the DUP to power sharing. Sinn Fein, as you know, voted 90% in January in favour of recognising, supporting PSNI, and the DUP have said that they, before they will go into power sharing with Sinn Fein have to sign up to the policing board, the district policing bodies, the PSNI, and the courts and the rule of law. So obviously there's a sort of catch-22 in that. So first of all, I wanted to start by discussing policing, then collusion, and whether or not collusion is a shadow hanging over this process, or whether collusion and what has happened marks a sort of terminal line at the end of this particular chapter in Northern Ireland's tortured history. So first of all, policing, and why is policing so important in trying to resolve and trying to reach a final settlement to the Northern Irish problem? John.
Thank you. And it's good to be here in London tonight discussing the issue of what's widely known, I suppose, as the Irish question, because in our discussion downstairs we were wondering how it went off the political radar. And I'm sitting here looking at the pictures around the wall of scenes of conflict throughout the world, and I don't see any from the north of Ireland. But I can recognise these scenes. Some in the restaurant downstairs, okay. Because I can recognise these scenes from my hometown, from the rural area I was reared in. Now, the faces are different, the people are different, but the scenes and the consequences are the same. And what we have to recognise now, and surely people need to recognise, is that there wasn't troubles in Ireland. There was a war in Ireland, and it was being fought by your government in a dirty way. Now, I'm going to come to the point of policing now.
If we can keep these initial contributions short and brief. Why is policing so important?
Policing was part of the problem, and was part of the problem even before the foundation of the state, and has certainly been a part of the problem since the foundation of the northern state, because it was referred to as arming the Protestants. Though I don't necessarily like that term, where you had the RUC and the B specials and the A specials, and even the C specials, armed to ensure that the state maintained its connection with Union, with Britain. And throughout those 60 or 80 years of the state, the policing has always been part of the problem. They weren't there primarily to serve the community, as you may know the bobby on the beat in your hometowns or cities or villages. That was not the primary role. It was to ensure that the nationalist community and the Republican insurgency was kept at bay.
John, thank you very much. John, why is policing so central?
The two key issues that kicked this conflict off were housing and policing. Housing has been pretty much resolved, I think. John would probably accept. But policing hasn't. And until it does, there won't be a peace that functions in the way that I think probably Sinn Fein wish it to function, and in a way that I think a considerable number of DUP people probably wanted to function, but perhaps not enough.
Henry?
It's all about normalisation. It's making a society normal, where there's a normal police force. There was an abnormal situation. You can argue chicken and egg, John, about who started what first, but I think Sinn Féin's acceptance of the PSNI is also, whether they like it or not, an acceptance of the state, and it's an acceptance of the reality they couldn't destroy the state. In many ways, it's an acceptance of the existence of the north of Ireland and its existence until the majority say otherwise. So in many senses, here's the controversial bit. I think it's the end of the traditional Republican project to destroy Northern Ireland by accepting policing.
Just before we come back to John, do we have Ian Paisley Jr. winging his way in? No, we don't. It's right.
You've been trying to get through.
I was going to say, I think all of us in our separate ways have tried to get hold of Ian Paisley Jr. or his father on our mobile phones or otherwise for many, many years. John, Henry is saying that that by agreeing to recognise PSNI, Sinn Féin effectively recognises partition. Presumably that's something with which you would not agree.
No, I certainly wouldn't agree. It was Sinn Féin who put policing on the negotiating table during the Good Friday Agreement. During those negotiations, we said to both governments that if we're going to travel down the road to peace and reconciliation, as it's entitled, we need to solve policing. Republicans always knew they were going to come to this juncture because we put it there in the first place. Now, we believe we have reached the conditions where we can establish a civilian police service. But you see, if people are saying to us, by recognising the police, you recognise the northern state and you recognise partition and you recognise the end of the Republican struggle, then there's not something wrong with us, there's something wrong with policing. Because if that's what policing is about, if policing is about maintaining the state and maintaining the status quo, then policing is wrong. It's not our strategy that's wrong.
Why is PSNI, the body that you are in principle prepared to recognise, different from the RUC?
Well, it's in terms of how any policing service is managed and held to account. And I think that through the Patton report, which was a beginning as far as Republicans were concerned, it started to make a change. Now, the British government, in true British government style, made a mess of it for a number of years through the McDonald bills. At that stage, we said to both the British and Irish governments that we couldn't sign up to it. The SDLP held off for a while and then went on board. But since then, we have been negotiating with the British government in relation to that, and they went back to the House of Commons, I think, on 3 occasions to bring in accountability measures which were there under the Patton report. Now, we have a police ombudsman who has greater powers than any other ombudsman in police services and probably in Western Europe, and indeed has greater powers than the one down south.
And has she done a good job?
Well, I think she's done a reasonable job. I think she's done a reasonable job in very, very difficult circumstances.
I want now to move on to onto the issue of collusion and the police ombudsman Nuala alone. I think in January this year, published this remarkable report that revealed how a group of members of the UVF were responsible for, a dozen murders in Belfast, and many members of this particular group were also acting as police informants, police agents, were being paid by the police. One of them paid £80,000, who was himself involved, it appears, in one of the murders. And they were doing this with the full knowledge of their RUC special branch handlers. In her report, Nuala Alone says, these are my words, not hers, but this is her sentiment, that this was simply the tip of the iceberg. Now, one of the experts on collusion, I mean, you're all experts on collusion in your different ways, John empirically, but John Ware as a journalist who's investigated collusion from Brian Nelson onwards. John, when Nuala Alone says that this was not a one-off, perhaps that's an understatement, isn't it?
I suspect so. I mean, we come back to this question of how you define collusion, and I think probably for the most part the evidence suggests that there was collusion by omission, so to speak. I'm not mitigating that quite deliberate act, because when you decide to omit to forewarn someone that they're going to be murdered, you are in effect colluding. You are, in fact, colluding in the act.
But that's not just because they forget to inform
the
individual, is it?
No, absolutely right. There is now an abundance of evidence that omission was a deliberate act. Now, we then come to the next question. Was it to protect the agent in place, or was it because they approved of what the particular paramilitary group was intending to do? And you have to look at each case on a case-by-case basis. There is plenty of evidence to suggest that both was pretty prevalent. I think myself that, I think Sinn Fein has used the policing issue as a very effective bargaining chip. Quite how much mileage is left in this bargaining chip we'll see in the coming weeks. But I do think that unless and until the collusion issue is resolved, to use a vogue word, transparently, and I don't think it's going to be, if when you look at the way, for example, the Finucane public, quotes unquote, public inquiry is shaping up, a great deal of that seems to me to be likely to be held behind closed doors, and I don't think it will command the same, public acceptance for whatever verdict it reaches, unless a great deal more of it is held transparently. If you look at the Bloody Sunday inquiry, whatever criticism you may make about its expense and length, I think you'd be pretty hard-pressed to conclude that it wasn't manifestly transparent, and that it was that it has been a genuine effort. Am I going on too long, Peter? Sorry.
Well, I just wanted to... John, you would never go on too long.
Okay, all right.
Perish,
anyway,
perish
you get the point that it's got to be transparent.
I just wanted to add a thought to that, which is that it's what amazes me looking at this is when you read Nuala Alone's report, and when you read the report into Brian Nelson, and you read what Hugh Ord had to say, and what John Stevens, because basically Hugh Ord did the report, what John Stevens said about Brian Nelson and collusion, it's astonishing that, given historical precedent, that people in these positions are prepared to be as outspoken about what actually happened, which gives credence to many of the things that Sinn Fein had been saying. But the point I was going to ask Henry is that what's equally surprising is that we've been here not just before, but before and before and before. I mean, I remember when I was investigating Stalker in the mid-1980s. After that, there were guidelines on the use of informants. similar guidelines on the use of informants following the Brian Nelson investigation, the Finucane investigation, and now NULA alone is talking about new guidelines for the use of informants. And how can we have a situation in which this issue comes back to haunt us time and time again, and when you read what NULA alone is saying, it's exactly what has been said by various people in authority for the past 20 years, if not more.
Peter, it was a dirty war, but it was a multifaceted dirty war, and collusion was multifaceted. And here's where I want to throw in a bit of a caveat. Why will collusion not colour the outcome of a political settlement here? Because all the parties in the settlement, and many of them in the conflict, are caught up in collusion. Collusion was not just about loyalists, certain loyalist gangs being run by the British forces. And if they were being run by the British forces, they weren't run very effectively. 1.49 of the casualty list of the Northern Ireland Troubles were Republicans killed by loyalists, 1.49% of the actual deaths of the Troubles. But leaving that aside, let us also remember that the British state were running agents within the IRA. Freddie Scappaticci, the head of the IRA's Internal Investigations Unit, Steak Knife, was a British agent. He was killing people whilst being in the pay of the British state.
Yes, but the IRA wasn't directly involved in collusion.
No. Well,
people within the IRA.
Exactly,
yes.
but the British state was using their
between
agents, the British, and they were directing them. And who's to say that they knew that certain individuals were being killed because of what their agents were doing? And my suggestion is this, and I can't hint it any stronger than this, that it's in the interests of certain parties, not only on the unionist or loyalist side, that the collusion issue does not colour the political outcome of the assembly, the talks and all that there, because it could throw up embarrassing revelations, not just about loyalists and the British.
John, yeah.
Just to try and answer directly the question you posed, which is, we've been around this racetrack many times, and I suspect the answer to that is that there is an extremely powerful organisation within what was the IUC and now is the PSNI, namely the Special Branch, and I'll give you a for instance of its current power, as it strikes me. Now, Hugh Ward, as perhaps many of you know, was John Stevens's sort of bagman on his third collusion inquiry, and he was getting stuck into it. I think Hugh Ward had been Chief Constable, Henry would know this better than me, but around a year or more before NULA alone brought to his attention, not something he discovered off his own bat, but brought to his attention the fact that this agent, Mark Haddock, had been allowed for a decade or so to murder at will, rob banks at will, deal in drugs at will, and I strongly suspect Mark Haddock is not the only one. Now, you have to ask yourself, what kind of a... I'm not sure... does this reflect on Hugh Ward's becoming a gamekeeper as opposed to the former poacher that he was, or does it reflect more on the power of the Special Branch? And I suspect the truth is probably the latter. And I just want to say one other thing, that I think the elephant in the room on all of these matters, I'm not saying this in some sort of agitprop way, but I think the elephant in the room is the security service. The security service is one organisation.
And the security service is now going to be running intelligence in Northern Ireland.
Well, indeed, and the security service is the only organisation that had access to all of the agents. I mean, the police, of course, had notionally access to all of army intelligence. The army was a little selective about how much it told the police. But the one organisation that had access to every single one of them and paid Mark Haddock's fees of £70,000 plus was the security service. And we've heard nothing about them. And I don't suppose...
I'm not sure, John, that you're better informed than I am on this, but the impression I always got is that the Special Branch within the IUC was, the force within the force aligned to itself. Yeah. Relations between Special Branch and Army Intelligence, the FRU, and Special Branch and Security Service was always fraught. And I was never convinced that the special branch officers shared their intelligence with MI5,
No,
or MI5 shared its intelligence.
Well, I
with
think
the
that's a
special
very fair point, and I think that's a very fair point. Before we get carried away and suggest that the security service is the all-seeing, guilty party in every respect here. I know myself of a case when the security service, but for the security service, Nelson would have whacked, to use the Belfast vernacular, a provisional IRA person who was also an agent. And the security service intervened at the last moment to ensure that the IEC, as it then was, set up a roadblock, and it didn't happen. However, that does not absolve, it seems to me, the security service from its oversight role, and a lot of questions remain to be answered about
the point, Peter,
Sorry,
is
I
important.
just want to come to, if you don't mind, Henry, just come to John. And the fact that the security service MI5 will now be the lead agency in intelligence gathering in Northern Ireland, and if Sinn Fein does sign up to policing and does join the policing board, you would expect MI5 to be accountable to you and your colleagues and the other members of the board, regardless of what party they belong to, wouldn't you?
First, let me answer that point first. I want the MI5 out of Ireland. So I do. Full stop. I want them out of Ireland because they have been a malign influence in Ireland. And you see, if there is MI5 involved in that sort of activity, I want to create a policing service who will arrest them and put them in jail.
So just let me figure out that. If you say you want MI5 out of Northern Ireland, and
I want them out of Ireland because I'm sure they're operating in Dublin as well.
Okay. I'm not sure they're operating south of the border, but that's another question. Okay. I think there may be another agency involved down there.
State trips, Peter.
But hang on a second. But if that is the way that you feel, and I suspect that's the way that most of your party feels, and certainly your leadership, because MI5 are unlikely to get out of Ireland, be it north or south if they're there, is that going to be a stumbling block? Is that going to be one of the issues that you raise in the negotiations as to whether or not you join, you recognise the police, if the lead agency is the people who want to Ireland?
It has already been involved in the negotiations, and during the St Andrews Agreement, the British government published part of the St Andrews Agreement, Annex E.
Sorry. Hello, Ian. It's Peter Taylor at the Frontline Club.
Hi, Peter. Sorry for ringing in late. I'm running on a huckle time, as they say.
Right. Can you hear us okay, Ian?
Yes, I can hear you loud and clear.
Well, thank you very much for joining us. Just to bring you up to speed, we've been discussing the importance of policing and the issue of collusion. Ian, if you could just give us your thoughts very briefly on the centrality of the policing issue in terms of finding a resolution to the political conundrum, and secondly, what your party's view is of collusion, and is it something that's going to stand in the way of agreement, or is it effectively now drawing a line under what has passed? First of all, the importance of policing, Ian.
Well, Peter, as you know, we went into the St Andrews talks saying that we were going there for one thing, and that was to achieve delivery, and to achieve delivery on the issue, the central issue of support for the police, the rule of law, and support for the courts. And we made it very clear that if parties can come up to that mark and support those things, they qualify as democratic organisations. And on that basis, we would see significant change on the ground. We would see witnesses being free to come forward and give evidence. We would see criminality being attacked by all sections of the community, and the police emboldened and able to attack criminality and deal with the roots of play with the support of the
Ian, what does Sinn Fein have to do, or have to say, but more importantly have to do, to convince you that it is genuinely committed to supporting the police, the courts, and the justice system?
Well,
what will convince you?
Peter, by your question, you of course put your finger on, because you are expert in Northern Ireland affairs. It's not what they say that matters. It's what they do.
What do they have to
we
do,
are
Ian?
trying to establish a process whereby we can measure them accurately and say that on the ground there are significant changes and they are supporting the police. I'll give you an example. A litmus test would be the atrocious murder of Robert McCartney. Sinn Fein know who carried out that murder. Sinn Fein still associate with those people. Sinn Fein could encourage the community that are too frightened to give witness statements for fear of intimidation after giving witness statements, for that community to come forward and have the full support of the Republican community in doing that. And if that were to happen, you would see serious and organised crime like the McCartney murder and other crimes beaten.
Okay,
and
Ian, just let me put that, sorry to interrupt, just let
everyone in Northern Ireland.
As you've raised that question, just let me put that to John O'Dowd, who, as you know, is Sinn Féin's chief whip in the Assembly. John, you heard what Ian said. If that's a litmus test, a test case, would Sinn Féin, I know you can't speak for the party, but can you see Sinn Féin encouraging people to come forward and give the PSNI information on those who were responsible for the murder of Robert McCartney?
Firstly, Sinn Féin did not get involved in the peace process to set tests for anybody. I'm not revising for tests for the DUP or anybody else.
Can you try and answer?
I am going to answer your
question.
There is 2 people currently facing trial in relation to the Robert McCartney murder. There has been several hundred statements made to the PSNI in relation to that murder, and Sinn Féin is on record as saying that anyone with information in relation to the Robert McCartney murder should come forward and make statements to the PSNI.
Do you accept that, Ian?
Can I just finish
what Sinn Féin have said?
The only point I would reiterate is this, that hundreds of statements haven't been made to the police. Hundreds of statements have been made to solicitors, to the policing ombudsman, indeed to everyone but the police. And what we want to see is Sinn Féin encouraging those people in the bar that night, many of whom they know, some of whom are actual Sinn Féin members, going forward, giving statements directly to the police, and allowing that witness evidence, crucial eyewitness evidence, to be used in open court, so that the person who gouged out the eyes of Mr. McCartney, slit his throat, and left him for dead on an alleyway in Belfast, that man...
Okay, Ian, I think we know what happened to Mr. McCartney.
See if we're setting tests for each other, Ian. And I don't think that's the way to solve a conflict that we are coming out of. Because, remember this, you represent Ballymena, which is the hard drugs capital of Ireland. So it is. So you see, if you're so good at solving law and order problems, perhaps you could solve that problem there. But let me ask you this. Finlay Sprott...
As the challenge has been thrown down about Ballymena, where I'm sitting tonight, let me tell you what I did 2 days ago with regards to trying to combat crime in my constituency. I was able to provide the police with information about a crime that was going on. The police were able to take that information, use it for gathering evidence, and to arrest people. As a result of that, we've seen drug dealers arrested. I saw other people smuggling illegal gotten gains into the constituency. That evidence was given to the police freely, using the police to combat crime in the constituency.
You mean the same way as Sinn Féin done in Uri, when there was a man murdered recently?
All crime will come to an end. No one is suggesting that. There will always be criminality. What we are trying to do is ensure that politicians play by the same rules.
Can we just establish how the policing issue is likely to be resolved? That Sinn Féin are saying that they will recognise the police if the DUP accept Sinn Féin as partners in a power-sharing government. Now, I know there are nuances involved in this, but before we come to Ian and John, who are participants in this process, just let me ask Henry and John Ware how they assess the likelihood of that conundrum being resolved. Henry?
Well, let me just say one thing about Robert McCartney, because I'm from that area and I knew Robert McCartney, I knew the family very well. And there is still a cover-up. There is still intimidation of witnesses. And I know it's not fair, Johnny's not from the area, so I mean, I'm not sort of leveling any criticism there, but as far as I understand, there's still a lot of serious intimidation of witnesses.
Well, you brought that information forward?
Well, I was not there on the night,
right,
so I didn't see
you're speculating.
You brought the information forward. I'm from that area, and I know. Right. And I could give you the names of the people who killed Robert McCartney.
Well, then you bring that information forward. You bring that information forward to the PSNI. Don't be broadcasted here. Bring it forward to the PSNI.
With respect, can we move on from the tragic death of Mr. McCartney?
I'm confident about that, right. Anyway, that's on the side.
The likelihood of a deal being done.
Well, I think the likelihood of a deal is this. My view is, I think the DUP are desperate to be the leading force in a government in Northern Ireland. I think Sinn Fein are very keen to get into government as well. It's not a question of if, it's a question of when. I think, and but there was a consensus around the table earlier about this, and it was that the so-called deadline, like so many deadlines the British government impose on the Northern Ireland parties, will slip. I don't think they'll wind up the Assembly. I think the prize is too big. But I think what they will do is they'll let it slip towards Easter. Then there'll be an Irish general election in May, and they'll be saying, well, we've got to let the Irish government be sorted out. We can't. This is an Anglo-Irish partnership.
May well have departed
quite
these shores.
Although I suppose in retrospect he can claim the legacy as opposed to on the time. Maybe Gordon Brown will invite him over when the parties get together in October sometime this year. But I do believe that they're going to give the DUP a bit of time to sell it to their party to avoid a split. The key person I think to watch for, the key touchstone person to watch for in the DUP is Nigel Dodds, the MP for North Belfast. The way he moves is the way the DUP move. Now, Ian may disagree with me, but I think he'll be the weather vane. We used to talk about Lord Taylor being the weather vane of the Ulster Unionists when David Trimble, if you remember him, was the partner with the nationalist parties in the post-Good Friday agreement. I think that's the key, but I have a sneaking suspicion that the deadline is elastic and may stretch all the way to the autumn, but I don't think
John, can you see the deal being done and the issue of policing being resolved to the satisfaction of both parties?
I just don't know. 10 years ago, I would, if you'd asked me, is there going to be, say 12 years ago, is there going to be an enduring peace in Northern Ireland with the provisional IRA reconciled to the uselessness of violence, I wouldn't have believed you. So I just don't know. But what I do know is that unless if the issue of processes about policing is going to be the stumbling block for both Sinn Fein and DUP. Sinn Fein on the one hand saying, unless you do X, Y, and Z, we're not going to, in a practical sense, buy into this process. And DUP saying, unless you prove X, Y, and Z, we're not going to let you anyway. Then the last stages of both respective Rubicons will not have been crossed. And I think it is interesting to return to the security service issue here, because I wonder whether it isn't going to become the ultimate stumbling block. I mean, if Sinn Fein is not going to engage in this policing process fully and wholeheartedly, because the security service is building a big office block, as I gather it is at the moment. But that is going to be a non-negotiable issue, not just, I imagine, for the DUP, but for the British government.
Just on the practicalities and how the mechanism is going to work. I mean, Ian has said that the touchstone for the credibility of what Sinn Fein says rests in things like the community being encouraged to give information and everything else. What is your touchstone? What does Sinn Fein need to see from Ian Paisley Jr. and his father and his party and Nigel Dodds and everybody else to convince you, Sinn Fein, that they are serious, that they genuinely and astonishingly, given what we've all witnessed over the past 30, 35 years, they are prepared, the DUP is prepared to share power with Sinn Fein? What does Ian Paisley and his colleagues have to do to convince you?
We aren't in the business of setting tests for anybody, and as I've already said...
Well, hang on. Wait a minute. You want to see certain things from the DUP.
All I want to see
what do they have to do? You tell us.
It's a small little word. Yes to power sharing. Yes to power sharing with their nationalist and republican neighbours on the island of Ireland. That's all we're looking. And in relation to policing, I know the North has fallen off the English political agenda and the news agenda, but we have already said that we're prepared to move forward in policing. We have removed MI5 from policing. Do you see the MI5? Do you see MI5? Do you see the excuse me? Do you see MI5 who's building their big base in Hollywood? They're the ones I'm not worried about. Do you see the ones who aren't in that building? They're the ones I'm worried about. We want to create a policing service where those who are involved in wrongdoing, whether they be from whatever community they're from, or they're involved in the British security services, are arrested. So that's the community.
Even if those wrongdoers are members of Sinn Fein or Republicans, doesn't make any difference.
You're involved in criminology.
You see them brought to justice.
You cannot hide under the blanket of republicanism.
Okay, let me go back to Ian. That John has said that all he wants, in one simple word, from the DUP is yes. Yes meaning you are prepared to share power with them. Can you say yes to that, Ian?
Two things. My party...
Can you say yes to it?
Well, I'm about to answer the question in a way which is very positive. Between 1998 and 2003, my party were in a power-sharing government in Northern Ireland. Maybe John wasn't around for that, but my party had 4 ministers over the period of that time in a government. Now, they might have not behaved the way some nationalists and Republicans would have liked them to behave, but we have proved our bona fides. We can do the power-sharing stuff. That's not what this is about. It's just a rouge. This is about Sinn Fein qualifying to come into government to the standards that everyone else was qualified. And I must say, what would be very helpful is if Sinn Fein stopped telling their own community lies and actually were honest with them. And there's 3 things they should say to be honest with. First of all, after 30 years of terrorism, they're not getting their United Ireland. Secondly, if they want into government, they have to support the police, the courts, and administer the rule of law from a British devolved parliament.
So hang on a second.
In other words,
Sinn Fein, realistically, Sinn Fein is not going to say we've abandoned our goal of United Ireland.
Murdering other people for. And that's the bottom line. I think they have to be honest enough, big enough, mature enough to realise that the Republican project as a violent organisation did not achieve those results. And whenever they're honest, I think we'll actually start to make progress in all of this.
But Sinn Fein are never going to make that admission.
We're not. There's no admission to make. My primary goal for getting up in the morning is to create the political conditions where there's United Ireland. That's what my political project is about. And to see if you believe for 1 second that the Sinn Fein project was over, you'll be power sharing with us tomorrow.
Ian, let me ask you. Obviously, you can't speak for your father, but you can speak for your party because you're the justice and policing spokesperson. What? I've lost my train of thought now.
As you said, yes.
Just talk among yourselves. Yeah, that's it. How do you sell to your grassroots supporters, the supporters which for years and years and years have looked to the party, and in particular looked to your father as the Rock of Ulster? How do you sell? How does your father sell? How do you sell sharing power with Sinn Fein? How do you convince them that Sinn Fein has changed?
I mean, the reason why I'm late tonight on your programme is I've been going around the doors in my constituency, talking to grassroots unionists, and indeed selling our policies to them. And our policies spell this out very, very clearly. If Sinn Fein become a democratic organisation, deliver to our satisfaction on this policing, rule of law, and support for the courts project, if they deliver on that, then I believe that at that point we can move forward into a governmental arrangement. But I believe that Sinn Fein are the party that has to do the travelling in this. We have met the standards, the British government, the Irish government, indeed the US administration, all accept the DUP's bona fide. And they say the DUP is ready for government. They've accepted that, indeed they've even set a deadline for it. We didn't set the deadline, they did. It's up now to Sinn Fein to do the delivery on the policing stuff. And as soon as they do it, the better for us all. And I hope that they do it, because for all our sakes it will be a better thing. And I must say that on the doorsteps, I'm getting a very, very positive reception that we have been the party that's been doing the pushing, setting the agenda, and it's good to see that the DUP, for once, is squeezing Republicans instead of Republicans squeezing concessions from a British government.
But effectively, isn't what you're saying is that the way you sell it to your community is that we have beaten the IRA?
So, first of all, the IRA had to dump their arms in a secret bunker in front of a cleric and in front of an international commission.
You accept that?
The Ulster Defence Regiment and the Royal Irish Regiment marched off the field of battle and were given the highest accolade and honour by Her Majesty the Queen. I think in those circumstances, we can proudly say we won. We didn't run away. We didn't have to dump arms secretly. We're still got the lawful forces of the Crown administering Northern Ireland. And indeed, if Sinn Fein want into this government, their ministers have to take a pledge of loyalty and support for the policing service and for all the institutions of policing. Now, all the institutions also include military and security intelligence based at Hollywood. This is a huge Rubicon for Sinn Fein to cross. So let's stop bluffing and saying they're going to accept some of policing, the beating criminality stuff, but they're not going to accept the intelligence gathering stuff. You embrace it all. You can't be half pregnant in this game. It's all or nothing. And that's why Sinn Fein have really got to be honest. And that's why I think that your speaker from Sinn Fein tonight, John Dowd, is being completely disingenuous with his own electorate when he says the things that he says.
Just let me pause there for a second, because I'd like to ask some of our audience what, first of all, their feelings are about the likelihood of the deal, the historic deal, finally being done as, you know, observers from the outside or observers from the inside. Gentlemen, if you wouldn't mind just saying who you are, that would be helpful.
Patrick Kennedy. I'm pessimistic on the basis of what I've heard this evening, Peter. A large proportion of my £7 has been wasted because I've heard the same old atavistic claptrap from two diametrically opposed politicians that I've been hearing for 38 years now.
I think that's slightly unfair.
Well, you've got your judgment, I've got mine. The better part of this evening was when you had Henry McDonald and John Ware commenting from an independent position earlier. I'm pessimistic. I find myself in rare agreement with Mr. Paisley just now when he talks about the representative from Sinn Fein, in my words, dissembling to their own electorate. They've been dissembling to the rest of us for a long time now. And I would totally ally myself with Henry McDonald's comments at the outset about their acceptance of the status quo, but yet they still seem to be in denial about that. How can we move forward when that is part of their public position?
Henry?
Well, actually, I actually don't share your pessimism, despite your reasons for it. I suppose in a way, there's a kind of game of smoke and mirrors being played. I mean, in many ways, John will disagree with this fundamentally, but essentially, Sinn Féin is like a constitutional nationalist party, the way the SDLP is, a bit more radical, but essentially it's saying, yes, we want a united Ireland, and they have every right to say that, absolutely, but we need to persuade the majority within Northern Ireland to do that. That's what the Good Friday Agreement is about. It's about the acceptance of the union, of the right of the majority in the north. I mean, it was a revolutionary transformation in Irish nationalist politics when the agreement was signed, and that's why unionists are very foolish to be anti-agreement and to be against the GFA. But civil society, and John was talking about this, and it was a very telling remark he made. The key issue on the doorstep, he said, was water charges. And I think the majority of people, if you go into the pubs, you go into people's homes, you go into any aspect of civil society in the north of Ireland today, the key issues are not, let's have a united Ireland tomorrow, let's have an independent Ulster, or let's return to some sort of so-called unionist Arcadia pre-69, or anti-Arcadia from the viewpoint of Catholics and nationalists. It's people have moved on, and the key thing about that is peace. That is the key thing. Even when I was canvassing out the other day, when I was following the Republican dissidents around as they were robbing doors in Derry, even they were grabbing reporters, myself included, and even the Sunday Times, and saying, by the way, we're not anti-ceasefire. In other words, there is a general consensus across the board that we're not going back to the way it was.
John, what's your view?
Yes, I think that's probably pretty inconceivable.
Does it really matter to the electorate? Do they care as to whether or not there's going to be a power-sharing executive yet again, or are they really quite content with their lot?
No, I think Northern Ireland wants. I think the vast majority of people in Northern Ireland want the same sort of devolution arrangements that exist in Scotland and to a lesser degree in Wales. I think that the possibility of having police officers knocking on doors in Turf Lodge and getting cooperation from the good people of Turf Lodge in respect to whether it's rape or drugs or weapons is something that the vast majority of people in Northern Ireland would like. Why wouldn't they? We all do. Why would they be any different? The answer is they are not. And I suppose if you really press me, I think the long-term trajectory is probably optimistic. I just think that the trouble is that the reason this story has fallen off the radar in Britain is because of the glacial speed with which
and also people think it's sorted here. I mean, I think one of the reasons why it's not an issue here
because
is that
people aren't
think
shooting
there
each
is
other.
peace anyway.
Yeah, that's right.
I mean, the BBC and ITV and the media are not full of reporting of these historic elections to be next week, are they?
Yep, that's right.
It's sorted.
Sort of.
Ian, just coming back to you, that Henry was saying that the cardinal issue on the doorstep is not peace in Ireland, historic deals and everything else, and Tony Blair's legacy. It's water charges. What's the impression that you get on the doorsteps? Are people saying, Ian, do the deal, give us a new tomorrow, you're on the right lines, or are they saying we don't want to pay our water charges?
Well, people aren't as fanciful as that, but they are as practical as that, if you allow me to expand. But first of all, I think that the issue of delivery is key for them, but delivery comes in two parts. Whilst they understand all the political stuff that we've been talking about in terms of making sure that the Sinn Fein deliver what they have to deliver, they also want to see the British government, Tony Blair's administration, delivering so that devolution can really affect beneficial changes. In other words, we don't want a second-class type of devolution that doesn't have the oil in the tank to make it go forward. So we need to have an economic package, and people are very keen to say, well, if you get this devolution, will there be the economic wherewithal to make it happen, to really make a difference to our lives? Will that affect our water bills, which are just landing on our doormats now? And certainly the water charges are very, very significant for the electorate, and I think those bread and butter politics reflect in the electorate by them saying, make sure that not only do you get delivery on the political stuff, but get it on the economic stuff.
But that's the common ground between yourselves at EUP and John and Sinn Fein, isn't it? That you both want devolved government, you want to be in control of your own destinies, you want your own ministers who will decide on the priorities as they see fit for their respective communities, or the community of Northern Ireland. That is what you have in common, John, isn't it? And that is what is likely to be, if this does work out, the driving dynamic behind it.
Yes, and well, in relation to Ian's point, I've yet to meet a politician who has not a positive response off the doorsteps. The only proof in the pudding is when the electorate cast their vote on the 7th of March, and then we'll know who had the positive response around the doorsteps. But we have more in common than we have in difference. And in relation to Patrick's point, I have to say you've aged well for a man who's been involved in listening to politics for 38 years. So you have. But in terms of politics in Ireland, it has moved unbelievably forward. People wouldn't imagine, it's been rightly said here, 12 years ago we are where we are. Where Sinn Fein has made the moves it has made, and we hope that the DUP make the moves they have made. Now, I'm surprised that you've come into a room tonight where there's going to be a political debate where certainly you didn't expect to find a love in. So it is. But, if any political debate has to throw up differences and changes and all that sort of stuff, I don't think that's a bad thing. I think that's a good thing. But, and it may sound negative, etc., but I think politics in the north of Ireland has moved on unbelievably. And I think we can find common ground with the DUP, despite all our differences and everything else, and that we can move on now. I hope it happens on March the 26th. That question remains to be answered.
Anybody else in the audience? Yeah. This lady here.
My name is Anne Higginson, and my mother is Northern Irish Protestant and my father is Northern Irish Catholic. And I was raised in Dublin, and I, oddly enough, ended up marrying a Northern Irish Protestant who served in the Royal Marines. So I have a fairly mixed background.
Pedigree.
And I wonder, how do people envisage... from that background, I've sort of been in contact with the various traditions, from nationalism to fairly staunch support for, the British establishment. And I wonder how peace will be achieved in Northern Ireland, whether it's possible to create an environment where both traditions are respected, because clearly Irish nationalism has made great progress through the Good Friday Agreement, but the eventual united Ireland would surely be at the expense of the people who support unionism.
Sorry to interrupt you, but isn't this at the heart of what we're discussing, which is that the dynamic, again, is that each community and its politicians respects the aspirations of the other.
Yes.
But eschews the use of violence to achieve it. That's the fundamental change marked by the Good Friday Agreement.
Yes, but I'm not sure that we would have got to this stage.
Sinn Féin's acceptance of PSNI and the DUP's acceptance of, given certain conditions, sharing power with Sinn Féin. Sorry, another point from the audience. Gentleman up.
Hello, Eamon O'Connor. I'm a journalist from Belfast. I want to ask the journalists on the panel what's going to happen about the senior detectives who were in the RUC, are still now in the police in Northern Ireland, who were directly involved in collusion. Until that's addressed, isn't there a perennial problem here? The provosts have controlled their soldiers and decided that they're putting down their weapons. Until the people who were in positions of authority and were, as I think Henry McDonald slightly blurred the issue as to when forces of law and order collude as opposed to when the provosts committed their acts of violence. When you have these people still in positions of authority in society, can you ever expect there to be a proper resolution and any real progress?
But also you've got to prove it. John?
I wouldn't bet on any charges, but we'll have to wait and see. I mean, Nuala O'Lone has proved herself to be a very tough and resilient person, and I guess it's not beyond the bounds of possibility. But I would say the way this thing is unfolded so slowly, and in particularly, for example, in respect of the Stevens inquiry, and they sent many files to the director, and I think in some cases, recommending prosecution, and those prosecutions haven't arisen. And I think everything's been put on the back burner for the series of so-called public inquiries. And I think that's probably the way this matter is going to be managed.
Isn't that a form of collusion in itself, that you simply turn a blind eye to it because you know that once you start pursuing it, you're going to stir up even more trouble, and the last thing we need, we need the proverbial, we need calm. We don't
in the end, these are political judgments, and the idea that, these would be in the end matters for the Attorney General, not just the Director of Public Prosecutions. The Attorney General in the end decides where the public interest, quote unquote, lies, and that is the political dimension that feeds into these very tricky, tricky for the political.
Ian, would you want to see former RUC officers? Okay. Well, if I ask the question to John, I know what the answer will be. You obviously would like to see prosecutions.
So I think that in terms of certainly those who were involved in that strategy of collusion, and it was a strategy, it wasn't a number of informers who went rioting. It was a strategy which can be followed up right up to, I think it's the Central Intelligence Committee at Cabinet level. There's a title for it.
Well, I personally would dispute that.
Well, certainly can be disputed, but I think there's enough evidence trail to go for
What evidence? What evidence?
Well, for instance, there has been no linkage ever made, evidentially.
There is no
Patrick
evidence.
Mayhew's deal with Brian Nelson, for a start, leads it right up to the Cabinet table.
Well, hang on a second. Patrick Mayhew would say that, but for him, Nelson would never have been prosecuted.
Yeah, but for Patrick Mayhew, the truth didn't come out at Brian Nelson's trial. A deal was made. Nelson served a minimum sentence.
Well, I agree. That's true. Nothing like the truth that came out. But I'm not trying to. I'm not speaking for Patrick Mayhew. I'm just saying there was a trial.
That does lead it up to the Cabinet table. And in terms of the centre, it's not the correct title for it. It would be my opinion it leads there.
Well,
but in relation to how we deal with the past, I think the past needs to be dealt with. Now, how that is done, I think, needs to be in agreement with all those people who were involved in the conflict and may require an international perspective.
But that also involves what the IRA has been involved in.
Republicans,
yep.
so it does.
So
I'm not sitting here saying this war was one-sided. Republicans were involved in a conflict as well. But it's not.
So we can expect prosecutions of Martin McGuinness and all the rest of it, can we?
Well,
come
can
on.
you prove allegations against Martin McGuinness?
On.
Come on against
I think it's just.
Give us a break. Give us a break.
Gentlemen, a question, somebody else from the audience. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Rosalind Bain. I'm a journalist who specialised for 30 years on the Basque Country. And I just want to draw a parallel because I'm very interested that everyone thinks that policing is such an important issue and collusion. In the Basque Country, policing was solved. Despite massive collusion, politicians were actually put into prison and you got a Basque police force in the Basque Country. It didn't make any difference because ultimately there was no political agreement. There was nowhere to move forward to. And I have to say to you listening, I think there's the same in Northern Ireland, that you've got the Good Friday Agreement, but until the DUP can say yes, and I appreciate there are other caveats, how can it move forward?
But I mean, I know Spain quite well. I know the Basque Country. I've been in there quite a lot. The difference is the problem with ETA is that you've had so many splits within ETA. I mean, it far outweighs the number of divisions there have been in republicanism since 1969. So I think it's a bit of a loose analogy, to say the least. To draw
republicanism is pretty fragmented.
Well, I mean, compared to ETA, you know. Well, what I'm saying to you is that you now have a rump of ETA which did the Madrid bomb recently in the airport, in Barajas airport. I mean, they've reached the point of almost nihilism. I mean, you talk to people in Sinn Fein and they utterly despair of the current position of ETA vis-a-vis the Spanish state, and you know, but I mean, the positions are somewhat different in a sense too. I really can't see the difference. And I know that there's a lot of criticism of the Basque police force. People have been ineffective apart from anything else. But can I just say something else? Someone was accusing me of blurring the boundaries. I'm not blurring the boundaries. The two things are interrelated. The problem for the British state, and it is a problem for the British state primarily, is if they have a full-blown open disclosure of police officers or MI5 officers who are running agents vis-a-vis the loyalists, which they were, some of whom, one of whom killed a colleague of ours, Martin O'Hagan, let's not forget, in John's constituency, and in fact in his hometown. The problem is it also opens a bigger can of worms about other agents on the other side the British state were running too. And that's the paradox and the problem for the British state and for key players in the peace process.
Another question from gentleman on the end there.
Thank you. Michael Gilligan, earlier on in the talk you were mentioning that the deadline could be quite possibly become very elastic. If it does become very elastic and it changes from a Blair government to a Brown government, do you anticipate any changes in the way that the new government would deal with this peace process?
John? Do we have Ian Paisley back with us? Okay.
Would Gordon Brown's patience run out? Well, it might, and I'll give you a crude reason why. Because at the moment, for about 30-odd years, it's been balance due to the Treasury, and I'm not trying to invoke Harold Wilson in 1974, it was, but
sponges.
Anyway, exactly. As Chancellor, no doubt he is getting impatient, to say the least, about the failure of both groups to finally meet in the middle, because he wants the economy of Northern Ireland to grow and bigger tax revenues and to end a long-running and very large subsidy. So he might not have the patience, but I suspect he will. And in fact, actually, to be fair, whatever you think of Tony Blair, the one thing he has managed, apart from that dreadful, this is not a time for cliches, I feel the hand of history on my shoulder, he is in his element, wheeling and dealing and negotiating. I don't mean that in a cheap way. I mean, he's a very effective negotiator. He plays to people's strengths. He understands people's weaknesses. He's a natural negotiator. And, these things really matter, and they've been shown to matter in Northern Ireland. Now, whether Gordon Brown will wish to try and see himself benchmarked against his deadly rival in a field where charisma matters, and he hasn't got much. I suspect probably not.
I think John is right, and when future historians look back at this critical period, assuming a deal is done, they will put that down to Blair's particular political skills, which, as John says, have been tested fruitfully to the full by the way that he operates. But also in terms of what's happening at the moment, one suspects that all this has been orchestrated backstage anyway, that there is a sequencing of events, there is a tacit agreement or a covert agreement between the two sides that they will do this at this point, this at some other point. And I think a lot of this is down to, as John says, down to Blair's own personality and remarkable political skills in this area, but also the people with whom he works, because in the end Blair does the deal, but it's the groundwork and the nuances and the appreciation of the history that provides Blair with the framework in which to operate.
Yep.
Yeah.
Thanks very much, Gary Kent. Most people in these debates always bring their own elephants into the room, and I'd like to add one, which is the deep segregation of Northern Ireland society. If we talk about two communities, sooner or later we've got to get to one. I mean, I think it's 2/3 of people in Belfast live in areas that are 90% segregated. Only 95% of kids go to non-integrated schools. And this costs, going back to the Gordon Brown point, a huge amount of money. Something like £1 billion a year goes in duplication of public services. So on this particular elephant, how do the parties and journalists here see segregation being overcome? And to throw another elephant, which is a security one, is we're going to hear a lot sooner or later about provisionals on the run, the on the runs being returned home, having charges waived. There are hundreds, perhaps, of people on the run from the provost and the loyalists who are exiled here and in various parts. And how is that issue, agents and others, going to be addressed? So two uncomplicated questions.
Just on the first point, if I may just have as a personal view, I think that if the deal is done and there is peace, I mean there is peace now of a kind we haven't experienced before in Northern Ireland, my own feeling would be that in the fullness of time, and that fullness will be a long time, the communities will settle down, the old animosities won't necessarily go away, but people will live together, and gradually what you may see, if you're lucky, is a reverse of the process that we saw in the 70s, whereby the two communities were totally segregated because they chose to do that for their own, for their own security. Henry, do you have you live there?
Yes, well,
John and I don't.
It's difficult because there is a lot of segregation. I mean, there are 50,000 surplus of places in schools in Northern Ireland, and yet there are still separate schooling, and even to get schools to share facilities, Catholic school and state school to share facilities, is difficult. I think it's all to do with one small step at a time. And you used the word earlier, glacial. Maybe that's a good thing. The history of the 20th century is about trying to impose a breakneck change on societies and ending up with a slaughter of millions. So, small steps, for example, like schools, maybe not merging, but sharing facilities at sporting levels, cultural levels, or whatever. I'll give you one small example where there are positive changes, just not to have a whole doom and gloom tone to this. I was on a loyalist house in the state in Lisburn a couple of weeks ago, and the ex-UDA prisoners are successfully integrating Polish migrant workers into the old Warren estate, which had a notorious reputation for sectarian violence in the 70s and 80s. They're now training ex-Republican prisoners in Newry to do the same thing in a housing estate in Newry. Former deadly enemies training each other on how to integrate new immigrants. Don't forget, there's a huge new immigrant community in Northern Ireland, and it's growing and it's going to get bigger. So those kind of small, incremental social changes are coming about. Who knows where it's going to lead, but I'm relatively optimistic. I think it can be done, but it's to do with political will. If you have politicians who invest in segregation and segregating their communities, then it won't work. But I think the dynamics of an assembly will propel them towards that.
John.
I'm not quite sure what you mean. I thought that had all been sorted out, hadn't it? OTRs? No?
Well, there are two sides to the equation.
Yeah.
One is a question of paramilitary fugitives, and I think that may or may not be sorted out or in the process. But the other side of the equation is several hundred, I'd guess, of people who've been expelled forcibly by loyalists and Republican paramilitary groups over the last 30 years. And, some are here, some are in the south of Ireland, some probably never want to go back, but surely they have a right to go back without being victims of the paramilitary organisations.
Well, they do have a right.
I think some have gone back, haven't they? Some alleged IRA informers have gone back and not been touched. Is that right, John?
Yes, that is absolutely correct. In terms of the OTRs, in terms of political OTRs, that situation has not been resolved. The British government still need to resolve that situation. In terms of those people who were expelled from the Republican communities due to criminality and other activities, they should return home. But you see, if they get re-involved again in criminal activities and all those other things, then it's up to the police service to deal with them. There should be no hiding ground for those people either.
You'll break their legs again, eh?
No, I think it's John. I'm pretty sure I said police
Sorry,
service.
it's a cheap shot.
No, John, that was a bit.
Actually, it wasn't so cheap.
Even by your high standards, John.
It was in the absence of. I'm more than happy to debate the subject.
I know
in the absence of a policing service.
Okay.
So I am not supporting or agreeing of it.
The other thing we haven't mentioned, and we're coming to a close, is that the remarkable, just doing a bit of reading around this, the remarkable independent monitoring group report of January, which gives the IRA an absolutely spotless, is the word I was going to use, but it is effectively spotless, clean bill of health, which says that it has ordered, and these three learned, good men and true, because they're all men, base their assessments on intelligence reports and everything else, say that the IRA has disbanded, has decommissioned that we know, has ordered its former volunteers not to be involved in any form of criminality. It is an astonishing report. And that is a measure of how much things have changed.
Absolutely.
So no longer do we, when I say we, collectively doubt the sincerity. I mean, the IRA, Gerry Adams has said, because I've asked him and he finally answered it, the war is over. Yeah. And as far as the IRA is concerned, the physical war is over. The political war, for the aspiration of a united Ireland, is still very much one to be fought.
Well, let me just say one thing about this, if I may, Peter, because I still think really the most tantalising and biggest story that remains to be dug out in Northern Ireland is how Gerry Adams, notwithstanding his almost indigestible tomes on this, which mean very little, how Gerry Adams did manage to get everybody to cross the road before him, which is a remarkable feat, and how he actually did it, having the vision. I speak as someone who's made pretty critical programs about him, but fair play to him, a man who had the vision and the tenacity, really, to stick with a process.
And also the support of Martin McGuinness.
And the support of Martin McGuinness. I mean, that is still... How that process was managed internally, I think, still remains to be told. I guess Gerry will one day tell it, but we won't hear it for some time.
Just let me ask a final question of our audience. By a show of hands, how many, this sounds like question time, or any questions, Jonathan, how many of you are optimistic that the deal that we've been talking about, the historical deal, and it would be genuinely historical, forget all sound bites and everything else, it would be genuinely historic. How many of you think that deal will be done? Very interesting. Sorry, and how many think it won't be done? So only two lone voices. That's really interesting. That it's almost unanimous. No doubt there are qualifications involved, but it's almost unanimous that people here this evening are optimistic that a deal will be done, and we will know whether or not that is true by the 27th of March, or perhaps even a bit later. I'd just like to thank you all for coming, and the millions and zillions and trillions out there on the internet glued to their computer screens, learning and agreeing or disagreeing as they've watched and listened to us all. And I'd just like to thank John Henry and Ian Paisley Jr. And Ian, if you can hear me, many thanks from all of us for taking the trouble to stick by your mobile and for us here at Frontline to keep on trying to get him. But it's been an interesting evening, and let us hope that your feelings of optimism are shared and realised. Thank you all very much indeed.